Classification charts, which I handed out a week ago, which we did not discuss on Thursday because we talked about wine tasting on Thursday. And today we will go back and pick up the wine classification charts. This is not a perfect chart. It's intended to be a guide for you, a pedagogical guide, some help to you in clarifying your mind or making this big wine world a little bit more easy to understand. It's not perfect for the reason that it's not completely dichotomous. Dichotomy is the art or science of classifying things into two groups, the right-hand group and the left-hand group. Or what we have here is a semi-dichotomous chart or semi-dichotomous classification of wine. For example, we could classify anything into red and not red. And then we could classify the red ones into sweet and not sweet, and the not red ones into sparkling and not sparkling. That is a completely dichotomous chart. Each one is mutually exclusive of the other. Having said that these are red, all of these, no matter how far down we carry this classification, will be reds. And having said these are not reds, all this classification, no matter how far we carry it on down, subcategories, will all be not red. Well, this chart is not quite a dichotomous chart for a very good reason. It gets to be too long if we make it completely dichotomous. The first part is completely dichotomous, however. The Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 are mutually exclusive from each other. Roman numeral 1 is wines with added herbs or flavor extracts, and Roman numeral 2 is wines without added herbs, or you may add without added flavor extracts. Those are mutually exclusive, and everything under 1 will have either added herbs or added flavor extracts, and everything under 2 will not have added herbs or added flavoring extracts. Well, let's consider then Roman numeral 1, the wines with added herbs, usually containing alkaloid material, bitter tasting material. That's why they're quite frequently called aperitif wines. They're supposed to stimulate the appetite. I'm not sure that's true with some of the sweet ones, but at any rate, that's the concept behind them. A fair number of these are red colored, and the ones on the American market at the present time that you'll find are wines such as Dubonnet, beer. If you ask for beer in France, this is what you get, B-Y-R-R-H, a red flavored wine. If you want beer, you have to ask for bière. You have to pronounce the I and the E both. Campari, which is a more or less of a wine, flavored, and also artificially colored, I might say. And another Italian one, Punte Mese, which is a sweet red wine. Most of these contain quinine, or cinchona bark, a tree that grows in Peru and South America. They're quite important. Dubonnet is sold in this country. If anybody, if you've ever been on the metro in Paris, what does it say in the metro? Been there for years and years and still there. At least it was a week ago, 2 weeks ago. As you go along the metro, you'll see these signs: Dubo, Dubon, Dubonnet. And then a little bit later on, it will be repeated: Dubo, Dubon, Dubonnet. As an advertisement for Dubonnet. Dubonnet is made in this country under a license from the French producers, and it's also made in France. It's sweet and red and slightly bitter. Not quite as bitter as beer. Beer is quite bitter. Most people in France who drink beer will drink it with some soda water in it to cut down the bitterness of it. Campari has a big advertising campaign going right now in this country. Campari and soda. Some of you have seen the new advertisements for it. Punte Mese has such a funny name that I don't think it's ever going to become popular in this country, but you'll find Italians who like Punte Mese. Now, without a red color, we have the dry or nearly dry, so-called dry or French-type vermouth. It's about 4% sugar, which makes it slightly sweet, but it's much drier than the second one, which is the flavored one with the Muscat odor, the sweet or Italian type vermouth. Probably the original kind of vermouth. The dry type seems to have been produced later than the sweet type. And then we have a large number of California flavored dessert wines appearing on the market. Thunderbird, for example, the original one. Most of these have citrus flavors. Silver Satin, another one. There are some 15 or 20 of them on the American market at the present time. They, too, are mostly intended for drinking with soda as a long drink. I don't think that sweet vermouth makes a very good long drink, but dry vermouth sometimes you might try over ice as a substitute for sherry or for some other aperitif. And there are a few medicinal types that are not produced anymore, but which were produced at one time, and which occasionally you'll see in Mexico or in home wineries. Gentian root, for example, is used to make a medicinal type of wine, rhubarb wine, and so forth. These are all flavored wines. They have a good deal of either natural or artificial flavors added to them. Well, those altogether probably don't represent more than 5% of the world's wine. So they're not a very large production of wine as far as you are concerned and as far as I'm concerned. Now in the next group we have wines without added herbs. That's the main kind of wines in the world, and if you look through, you'll see it's completely dichotomous. It just has an A, and on page 2 it has a B. So they are mutually exclusive then. 2A is the wines with excess carbon dioxide, and 2B is the wines without excess carbon dioxide. Now the ones with excess carbon dioxide are not completely dichotomous. It has 3 entries instead of 2. But if we ask you any questions on this, it will not be confusing. I will not give you 3. And furthermore, one of them is not very important anymore. The most important group is the ones from fermentation of added sugar. Usually from 2 to 4 atmospheres pressure. An atmosphere of pressure is about 16 pounds, so that means there's somewhere between 30 and 60 pounds pressure per square inch. That's what makes the cork pop and so forth. And then we've continued the dichotomy by classifying them with red colors and without red colors. These, in other words, are sparkling wines. The sparkle is achieved by the addition of sugar to the original wine. And if you have them pink, we call them pink sparkling types, or champagne rosé, or rosé sparkling types, and so forth. In different countries they have slightly different names, but they're easy to recognize. And the red ones, we call them California Sparkling Burgundy, or one company calls them Champagne Rouge for a little bit greater prestige, and so forth. In both cases, they're usually slightly sweet, for your information. There's a reason for this. Carbon dioxide itself has a certain amount of textural effect on your tongue, prickly sensation on your tongue. And if you add that prickly sensation to the tannin that's present in red wines, the astringency, which you observed in the laboratory, it makes it pretty rough and rather unpleasant to most people. So in order to cover that up, to smoothen that astringency impression that you get, that textural, rough textural impression from the carbon dioxide and from the tannin, it's customary to add a certain amount of sugar. And most of these red sweet wines, and by the way, Cold Duck would go in the second group here too, California Sparkling Burgundy, or Champagne Rouge, or Cold Duck. Those are all red wines that are sparkling, and Cold Duck may have anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6% of sugar in it. Most of the French sparkling Burgundies have 3 or 4% sugar in it. Some of the California ones have 4 or 5%. And the reason is, as I've just given. The more important group, however, is the ones that don't contain red pigments. We call them the anthocyanin pigments to give them their chemical name, but it simply means not red. And we can carry on the dichotomy here. There's the ones that have a Muscat flavor. There's only a very few of these produced in California. One called California Sparkling Muscat. But in Italy, there's a fair amount of these. They're called Muscato Spumante, meaning sparkling muscat in Italian. They're always sweet. Muscats, when they're very dry, taste bitter. So you will probably in your lifetime never really see, unless you make an experimental dry Muscat, you will never see a dry Muscat wine. Dry Muscat wines, whether they're sparkling or not sparkling, always have a slightly bitter sensation. They're usually rather flat. Muscats are low in acid to start with. So that adding some sugar to these helps to smoothen them out, give them some center of interest, and sort of cover up that flat flavor of the Muscat. It also seems to bring out the Muscat character. You take a dry Muscat and add sugar to it, and it seems more Muscatty than it otherwise would. So these are always sweet. Without the Muscat flavor, now there are a large number of wines in this category made all over the world, and I've indicated just some of the names for them here. California Champagne, or California Champagne Bulk Process, or Champagne. Now we'll stop right there and explain a difference in this chart. Where the type name is also the name of a region, where the type name is also the name of a region, we have capitalized the name. That's not because we believe it's any better or not, it's simply to distinguish regional wines from non-regional wines. So when it says a capital C, that means that it's Champagne from a region of that name in France. However, I have to say on the next one, the sect, shows how you can always get exceptions to rules. All German nouns are capitalized. So there's another reason for capitalizing the S in sect. Sect is not a regional name, but it has to be capitalized because it's a German name, and German nouns are always capitalized. Sect, if it was in English, if we translate that into English, you would say it was champagne with a small c. That's what sect means. There's a reason also why the word sect is used instead of champagne. Under the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I, the French were very anxious to protect the name Champagne. So they wrote into the Versailles Treaty a whole section prohibiting for all time the Germans for using the word Champagne for German-produced wines. This was not an arrangement that was taken lightly by the Germans, and they, even under Hitler, did not violate this regulation of the Versailles Treaty. They broke every other part of the Versailles Treaty, but this part they have maintained even today. And you'll find sparkling wines in Germany usually called sekt. It was a coined word, came out of some sort of musical comedy that had been written around 1910, and when the Germans were looking for a word, they didn't like the word Schaumwein, which means sparkling wine in German, so they coined the word sekt, and it's a registered name protected in Germany for sparkling wine. Spumante is the Italian, Espumante in Spanish, Champansky in Russian, or they have another word, Igersky, which means sparkling, which they sometimes use on the label. Now we can classify these into one of two categories, those that are pretty dry, below 1.5% sugar, and those which have more than 1.5% sugar. The dichotomy is still being carried on here. The ones with below 1.5 sugar are usually labeled Brut. California Champagne Brut, B-R-U-T, or California Champagne Natur. Both of these are on the market. These are pretty certain to be fairly dry. The threshold for sugar in white sparkling wines is about 1.5%. That means that 50% of you would find that to be completely dry. You would get no sensation of sugar at all. The other 50% might say it was slightly sweet. That's a threshold thing there. There are a few people who, there's no law on this in this country. There's been some published guides to it. We've suggested things, but there is no state law nor no federal law which protects the word Brut in any way, and so occasionally you may find a wine labeled Brut that has more than 1.5% sugar, that almost everybody would get as sweet. I can't do anything about that. I can simply say that that's not the way I would think it would be good for the consumers. The consumers ought to know that they're getting a dry wine or a sweet wine. The ones above 1.5% sugar, now here's one of those things that don't make sense, but it's the way the commercial industry is derived. If it says sek, which means sweet, which means dry, excuse me. If it says sek, which means dry, it means sweet. All sek wines are sweet. Why? Don't ask me. It's just one of those idiosyncrasies of the French industry originally, later of the American industry and other industries in other parts of the world. Sec can also be called in English dry. It'll say dry champagne. That means it's sweet. If it says extra dry, that means it's sweet. If it says demi-sec, that means it's sweet. And if it says doux, well, it's obviously sweet. Doux champagnes are quite popular in the Soviet Union, and you find quite a large number of them. It's rather hard to find a dry sparkling wine in the Soviet Union. Before World War I, the Russians drank a lot of doux French champagne, about 10% sugar, pretty sweet sort of concoction. At the present time, there's only one doux champagne being made in California. It's not very popular, but there's a lot of champagne being made in California, somewhere between 3 and 5% sugar. For a general purpose drink, I think that's probably all right. It's for people who don't want something really dry, the extra dry or the sec probably is a good kind of wine for wedding receptions and things like that. If you give them a very dry brut champagne at a wedding reception, some people will say, oh, it's too dry for me, let me have a scotch and soda or something like that. Now, there are two other kinds of sparkling wines. The second group at the top of page 2 is very minor and not really very commercial. And so I probably will not say very much about it, and you don't need to remember too much about it. Once in a while, there is a fermentation from residual sugar. This is pretty hard to control, and the wine usually gets gassy and as well as gets cloudy as well as gassy. So they're not very commercial. I said occasional wines. One of these is Vouvray, a wine from the Loire Valley in France. About maybe 20% of these wines are gassy from residual sugar. And another one is a very unique wine produced in California, some of you know it, called Muscat Amabile, produced over in the Napa Valley by the Martini winery. This is a wine that's fermented at very low temperature for a long time, and the carbon dioxide is retained at the low temperature. It's bottled under pressure, sold in a champagne bottle. The fermentation is from the residual sugar. No sugar is added, so it belongs in this category. And it only has maybe 8% of alcohol, so it's not very stable. If you buy it, they will suggest that you keep it in the refrigerator until you use it. As a matter of fact, it's not distributed through retail outlets for that reason. It's supposed to be kept under refrigeration. It was a favorite drink of Clark Kerr, the former president of the university. So I used to have to provide that when the regents met here on the Davis campus. Run over to Napa and get some Muscat Amabile so Clark Kerr would have something to drink. I must say that Chancellor Marak was rather fond of it too. He used it quite often. I think it's all right, a glass or two, but all Muscats tend to cloy. They're too obvious. Any work of art, any aesthetic work of art that is too obvious, you understand it too quickly and it doesn't have any mystery about it. And only the greatest things in the world are the things that have more mystery about them, things that you can't comprehend all at one time. That's true of novels, it's true of music, it's true of architecture, and it's certainly true of wines. So, although I think it's a very pleasant wine and a wine that you like the first glass of, I doubt if you drink very many glasses. There are a few other wines that are barely commercial, produced in various countries occasionally, that get their added carbon dioxide from a malolactic fermentation. And the so-called Vinho Verde, or Vinhos Verdes, if you want to put it in the plural, both white and red from northern Portugal are such a wine. They're not a very important commercial wine, but they are a type of wine, and some of the Italian wines from Piedmont are that way. Third category is also disappearing from the world, although I am one of the proponents of it and think it's a very good idea. This is wines to which the carbon dioxide is added artificially, so-called carbonated wines. We used to produce a lot of them right after repeal of Prohibition. There were at least a dozen or so California carbonated Burgundies, and there were half a dozen or more others, California carbonated Moselle, California carbonated Riesling, California carbonated Sauterne, and so forth. They've almost all completely disappeared from the market for the reason that they didn't have a very good image. They were poor man's sparkling wine, and if you're going to drink champagne or sparkling wines, the theory was that you had to drink the real thing. I think our increasing affluence also sort of drove them off the market. I really wouldn't know where to go and pick up a carbonated wine today on the American market. There must be some of them produced, and I'm sure some of you have seen them, but this class has almost disappeared. This is also true in Europe. There's very few of them produced. Once in a while you'll see a wine called a Mousseau in France. That's a non-champagne wine that's been carbonated. But not very often. You have to look for them. Now the next group is wines without obvious excess carbon dioxide. That's the great category of still wines. And the dichotomy is not perfect. If you look at page 2, 3, and 4, you'll see 1 on page 2. You'll see 2 at the bottom of page 3, and you'll see 3 on page 4. We've divided the alcohol contents into 8 to 14, 14 to 17, and 17 to 21. I can tell you that the 14 to 17 group is almost a no man's land. Almost a no man's land. So the dichotomy is between alcohol content of 8 to 14% and alcohol content of 17 to 21%. The middle category is very little used, and I'll explain about that in a moment. Now within the group, which is the most important group of all, the B on page 2, wines of 8 to 14%, more than half the wines of the world are wines with red pigments. There are some countries that don't like red wine, probably because they can't produce them very well, but that's not always true. Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria produce white wines because it's very difficult to produce red wines in those countries with all the fungus diseases they have and the brown color they get from the fungus disease. But that's not true of Spain, which also drinks white wine. They could produce all the red wines they wanted in Spain, but still they prefer white wines. We don't know why that is. But the French and the Italians, which are the world's greatest wine drinkers by far, they're wholeheartedly and overwhelmingly red wine drinkers. They have white wines, they do drink white wines, but most of the wines of the world, the most important class of wines in the world is B1A on page 2. Wines of 8 to 14% alcohol with an anthocyanin color. Well, we've carried the dichotomy to separate these into the pink wines and the full red colored wines. This is sometimes pretty hard to do. You can understand that in getting from pink to red, different people will see the color slightly differently, and somebody would classify it as pink and somebody would classify it as red. That occurs quite frequently in wine judgings in California. This is sent to the wine judging as a rosé wine. When you actually look at it, it looks more like a red wine. This has been sent to the wine judging as a red wine. When you look at it, it looks more like a pink wine. So the industry is not completely clear. We've recommended some chemical standards for this, and we teach a whole laboratory on this in Viticulture 125, just on how to distinguish this chemically or physically, actually. But the industry itself has not set any standards for this. It used to be that most of them were dry, but that's not true anymore. Almost, perhaps 75% of all the rosé wines in the world now are sweet. Part of that is our own fault. Some years ago, we ran a large series of tests, some 16,000 tests at the State Fair over in Sacramento, and we showed overwhelmingly that people preferred the rosé wine. The industry picked up this result and started making all the rosé wines sweet. I didn't finish my statement. Let me start again. At the State Fair, with about 16,000 people participating, we found that they preferred the sweet rosé wine to the dry rosé wine, about 75%. This was enough for the industry. It looked like a good guide. So the number of sweet rosés has increased since that time. And most of the rosés that are being imported at the present time, whether from Italy or from France or other countries, are also coming into this country at about 2 to 3% of sugar, so that they are frankly somewhat sweet. They're labeled here as California rosé types. Sometimes they have a varietal character or varietal name or a regional name. Tavel is a little regional name. I never got around to Tavel when we were talking about the Rhone wine. Oh, yes, I did. I said that this was how Ernest Hemingway wrote The Sun Also Rises, drinking 2 bottles of Tavel every day or more. And if you have another Sun Also Rises in your head and the Tavel will bring it out, why, I recommend that you start drinking Tavel right away. But I don't think it will unless you are another Ernest Hemingway. Gamay Rosé is quite popular in California. We have a number of Grenache Rosés, California. Somewhat difficult to tell these apart. They don't have a very high varietal character. I'll give you one clue. The Gamay Rosés are more on the true red side or the true pink side. They have no orange color in them, whereas the Grenache Rosés usually have a little orange or pink color in them. And since there's some Grenache in Tavel, the Tavel would also have a little of that orange color with the pink. And then we have a wine type called Grinolino, which comes from Piedmont. It's a rosé type from Piedmont. It's pretty variable in color. Some people who produced it in California have a clone is a variation of a variety. We have several different clones of Grinolino growing in Italy and also growing in this country. So the variation is because of the difference in the Grinolino grape that they're using. The sweet ones, well, as I said, many, I should say most California rosés. And for a while there was a pink Muscat produced down at Tulare. So it sort of disappeared from the market, but has a very pretty name, Aleatico. Aleatico. You will see this wine also pink and also sweet in Tuscany, in Italy. It's kind of cloying, but one glass of it may be amusing for you to have, and it does have a Muscat character. Aleatico is a Muscat, pink Muscat. Now the full red color, of course, much more important than the pink wines. Pink wines are really fairly a modern idea, and we've distinguished these between the ones that are with distinguishable, that are dry. What happened here? Full red color. Yes, full red color and dry as against those that are sweet. These are 8 to 14% alcohol, non-sparkling, non-herbed wines that have anthocyanin pigments and that have a full red color, and they're dry. And the dichotomy here is between those that have a distinguishable varietal character and those without a distinguishable varietal character. Now that word distinguishable is another word that's hard to define. What may be distinguishable to me may not be to you. What may be distinguishable to you may not be to me. And I'll give you some problems on that word distinguishable. But at least it's a guide to what you're going to see on the market. Usually Barbera has a high acidity, or always has a high acidity when it's picked. But it can have a malolactic fermentation, and the acidity can be much less. So not all Barberas are going to be really high in acid. There's one from Sonoma, there's another one from Napa that are not really terribly high in acidity. However, some from the San Joaquin Valley, where the malolactic fermentation has been prevented, are fairly tart. Most of the Barberas from Italy are fairly tart, although sometimes they too have had a malolactic fermentation. Most of the ones are with moderate acidity, and we'll go through these now just quickly and give you an idea where they come from and some of the ideas of it. Beaujolais, that's that district south of Burgundy where Gamay is used. The same Gamay that was used up there for rosé is also used to make a red wine in Beaujolais. Remember, that's an early maturing one. And then we have all the Bordeaux group of wines. All Bordeaux itself and the Medoc should have an accent. Saint-Emilion should also have an accent. Graves and Pomerol, all of those are red wines from the Bordeaux district. Burgundy, notice the capital B from Burgundy district. Pinot Noir wines from the Burgundy district. Cabernet Sauvignon, that's a variety. Châteauneuf-du-Pape may have a distinguishable varietal character. I'm not sure. It's a mixture of varieties, and it's pretty hard for me to distinguish the varietal character. Chianti also made a mixture of one or two varieties from Tuscany. That San Giovetto, St. John grape, and some other grapes may or may not be very distinguishable. Some people say it is, and I've erred on the side of leniency here. Fresa, that's a variety supposed to smell like violets from northern Italy, and I think sometimes it does. We've tried it here. The Beaujolais grape, Gamay, can be sold just as Gamay. You can find some California Gamays just as Gamays. They're red wine. Hermitage, that's a Petit Syrah grape down the Rhone Valley, and I think it does have a varietal character to it. Pinot Noir, of course, is a variety. Zinfandel is a variety. Now, without a distinguishable varietal character, they're not distinguishable for two reasons. One, they're not distinguishable because the varieties that are used don't have very strong aromas, very weak in aromas, or they are blended various ways. So it's not possible to say with any uniformity what their varietal character is. For example, California Burgundy, the very first one. You notice the small b, meaning not geographical. California Burgundy from one winery will look like California Claret from another winery. And California Claret from one winery will look like California Burgundy from another winery. They are not uniformly distinguished by the industry itself. Sometimes I find a Burgundy that has very unique and distinctive flavor. The next time I try it, it's not quite the same. So even within a single winery, the concept of the type is not always uniform. And certainly between wineries, one winery's Burgundy will be quite dark in color, another winery's Burgundy will be quite light in color in California. Burgundy, however, has taken the place of Claret. Claret has got a bad image for some reason or other. You will not find very many California Clarets anymore. Right after the repeal of Prohibition, there were more California Clarets than there were California Burgundies on the market. But Claret has pretty well gone out of the market. We recommended one time that California Dry Red Table be the name for all of these wines that are red and dry and don't have a distinguishable varietal aroma. That has never caught on with the industry. It's written in the regulations in Sacramento, but nobody pays any attention to it. California Red Chianti, that's another one that's disappeared since Prohibition. Right after Prohibition, the most widely distributed red wine in the United States was Italian Swiss Tipo Red, which was a red Chianti type, and said so on the label. You can hardly find Tipo Red anymore. It's practically disappeared. Barolo, that's a northern Italian wine made from the Nebbiolo grape, and the Nebbiolo grape is not very distinctive. So we put it in this category rather than in the previous category. Carignan, there's a good grape, but it doesn't have very much distinctive flavor. The late John Daniel, who owned Inglenook Winery, however, always said that we had underestimated the Carignan, that the Carignan was a better grape in the Napa Valley than we gave it credit for. But in the San Joaquin Valley, it certainly doesn't have, or the Sacramento Valley, it certainly doesn't have very much varietal character. Charbonneau, not very much of it. Planted in California, maybe 50 or 100 acres altogether. It ages quite well, but I could never identify it as a distinctive variety. De Reef is a variety that's practically disappeared in California. Malvoisie is another variety that's practically disappeared. These have been on labels at one time or another and have now gone. I don't know of a single De Reef. I don't know of a single Malvoisie. I don't know of a single Mouristel. Wente at Livermore used to produce a Mouristel, but that's all gone now. There's not any more Nebbiolo in California. It was grown in the San Joaquin Valley, and a couple of them were produced, but they were rather flat and didn't have a very distinctive character. Now, Pinot St. George is sometimes called red Pinot, and there is a very difficult question. We made about 60 of these Pinot Noirs, Pinot St. Georges, experimentally a few years ago. And we had a series of blind tastings with them. About a third of them had a varietal character. We could recognize it. We identified it as a Pinot. The other two-thirds, we couldn't recognize it. And so for that reason, I put it here. However, it's recently appeared on the market as a wine type in California. And I think perhaps it does have a certain amount of distinctive varietal character. I don't think red Pinot has survived. I think the red Pinot has more or less disappeared. Now, Petit Syrah in California at the moment, I'm going to make that very clear now, at the moment is not terribly distinctive. There are about 5 of them being produced in California. If you like them, fine, and if you can recognize them, fine. We think that that's probably partially a problem of how to make the wine and exactly where to grow the grape to make it distinctive. Because remember, we already met with this grape down in Hermitage in the Rhone. And so here it is coming into California and not terribly distinctive. The one from South Africa seems to me to be a little bit more distinctive than the ones from here. And it's made in South Africa. It's also used to a considerable extent in Australia, same grape, Petit Syrah. They don't put it on the label there. They use it for blending purposes. So it's a grape that maybe is better than being in this category that I put it in here. And finally, the Spanish red type, Rioja, from that little valley up in northern Spain. Neither one of those varieties, the Grenache or the Tempranillo, have a very distinctive varietal character. And so Riojas generally are rather hard to identify or distinguish. Now we have a few sweet red low-alcohol wines. Manischewitz and Mogen David, for example, kosher type of wines, which have been sweetened with sucrose, appear on the eastern market quite regularly, and they can be bought here in California. We recommended that one time that we create a type called Red Table, which would be slightly sweet, not dry Red Table, but Red Table, and Sweet Red Table, which would be quite sweet. But those never caught on. Those names do not appear on labels in California, except rarely, and we think they would be better than perhaps some of the others. Quite a number of proprietary wines in this, too. Proprietary means it's named by a winery with a name that they themselves have registered, and nobody else can use it. I think you will see increasing use made of this. Wineries not wishing to put, say, Burgundy on the label because anybody can make Burgundy, and not wanting to put Pinot Noir on the label because anybody can make Pinot Noir, are likely to coin a name for their certain kinds of wines. Some of them will be dry and some of them will be sweet. Now, without the anthocyanin pigments, we use the same dichotomy as we did before. Wines containing distinguishable varietal aromas and wines that don't have, or usually don't have, distinguishable varietal aromas. And the ones with distinguishable varietal aromas, we've separated them into the sweet and the not sweet ones. And the sweet ones are all the German Auslese types, the Tokais from Hungary, what we call light Muscat, light sweet Muscat. Both of these are on the American market now. Some of the Loire wines, some of the Chenin Blanc, that's the variety that grows in the Loire, Chenin Blanc. Some of those are sweet. About 2/3 of the California Chenin Blancs are sweet, and 1/3 of them are dry. I would guess that's about the proportion in the Loire Valley, too, for these. Sauternes are always sweet. Sweet Catawba from Ohio is always sweet, as the name implies. Sauvignon Blanc is usually sweet unless it has the word dry in front of it. Now, the industry produces both dry Sauvignon Blancs and they produce Sauvignon Blancs, which are likely to be slightly sweet. And the same winery may produce both, by the way, too. They may produce a dry Sauvignon Blanc and they may produce one that's not dry. Sauvignon Blanc is that aromatic flavored wine that I like very much. Semillon, another variety from Bordeaux. If it doesn't say dry in front of it, will usually have a little bit of sweetness to it. Semillon has still not found its place in California. Sauvignon Blanc seems to have, Semillon doesn't seem to have. I think it's quite a nice varietal wine. I even like it dry, but most people feel it has a little bitter character, and they prefer it slightly sweet. And there's some proprietary types in it, this group too. Christian Brothers, for example, produces a wine called Chateau La Salle, from the name of their order, the Brothers of Mont La Salle. And this is a sweet Muscat, belonging in this category here. Distinguishable varietal aroma, without anthocyanin pigments, 8 to 14% of alcohol, and sweet. Not containing sugar, well, we got a lot of those. All of the single white wines of the world. Catawba comes dry in Ohio occasionally. Chablis, notice the capital C from the region of that name in France. Chardonnay, the variety now, not the region, so the varieties have a capital letter. Sometimes called Pinot Saint Chardonnay. We prefer Chardonnay here at Davis. Chenin Blanc, I told you about 1/3 of them were dry. Sometimes they will be labeled white Pinot instead of Chenin Blanc. But that's pretty well disappeared now. That is, most of the Chenin Blancs are called Chenin Blanc. Delaware, very good variety in eastern United States, most often is dry. There's only one full Blanche, and by the way, the Blanche and full Blanche should be a capital, not a small b, for reasons that I can't figure out in French, but that's the way it is. One winery produces a full Blanche. It's a rather tart wine. Gewürztraminer, that's the spicy Traminer. There's a number of those in California, and there's been a large increase in the acreage of those in California. Graves, these are those grapes made from Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon from the Bordeaux region, and almost all of them are not sweet. Once in a while you'll find one that's slightly sweet. Grey Riesling sometimes is sweet, sometimes is not. Some Loire wines are dry, as I indicated. Moselle wines that are not Ausleses are dry, but they're getting harder and harder to find. And the next one past that, Rhine, that is not Auslese, should be dry, but more and more they're making them slightly sweet. Pinot Blanc is dry. There's only one or two of those produced in California. That's a variety. And now we have that dry Sauvignon Blanc and dry Semillon, which are dry. Sauvignon Verde is a sort of a worthless grape, but one or two people have made it. It has a slight Muscat character. Unfortunately, it doesn't do very well. Its bunch rots very easily and has bees damage to it. So you won't find very many Sauvignon Verdes. I think one on the market at the present time. Sylvaner, this is a grape from Germany and Alsace. There are 3 or 4 of those on the American market now from California. They're not terribly distinctive. I think I could usually recognize a Sylvaner, but some of them I couldn't. Traminer has practically disappeared. I don't know of a single plain Traminer on the American market unless it's been imported from Alsace. Gewürztraminer has taken its place. And then finally, white Riesling, the great variety from the Rhine, which we have here in California, usually called Johannesburg or Johannesburger Riesling. Johannesburger. That's because the grapes came from a little town, or a little hillside town in the Rhine district called Johannesburg. And so when the grape was brought here, it was called Johannesburg Riesling, but it's really what the Germans call Weisser Riesling or white Riesling. Different companies label them differently. There are 2 or 3 white Rieslings on the market, and there are a dozen Johannesburg Rieslings on the market. Theoretically, they're the same. Now, usually without distinguishable varietal aromas, we have a fair number of these on the market. Containing sugar, wines that says Chateau Napa or Chateau Livermore or Chateau this or that are usually sweet, and they're blends so that they don't have a distinguishable varietal character. Or California sweet white table wine. Most of the California Sauterne, notice the absence of the S in California. If the Sauterne doesn't have an S and has a small s, you can be certain it comes from California. If it's capital and has an S, it's French. And there are a large number of proprietary wines in this group at the present time. And not containing sugar, well, California Chablis, for example, can be a quite pleasant wine, and it has pretty well dominated the market the last 10 years. California Dry Sauterne has almost disappeared from the market. You can buy them, but there are not very many of them. The 2 kinds of wines that are on the American market at the present time that are dry, without distinguishable varietal aromas, are California Chablis and California Rhine. And you can put a big question mark after the Rhine because a number of the California Rhines belong in the group just above, with sugar. They're not all dry. So if you'll correct your charts accordingly, California Rhine, sometimes sweet. California White Chianti has gone the way of California Red Chianti. It's hard to find one on the market. We had thought that they would create a type called California Dry White Table, but it never occurred. Why, I don't know. French Colombard should have a D on it, Colombard. There are 1 or 2 of these being produced at the present time. It's a good grape. Does very well in Region 4. It's becoming one of the most important grapes for the San Joaquin Valley, along with Chenin Blanc, because it has a good acidity in that region. But it's not very distinctive, so I doubt if we will find very many of these on the market. We've already met with Gray Riesling as a varietal type up above, but there are some Gray Rieslings on the market that I'll swear I can't find any Gray Riesling character to them at all. And the same thing is true of Sylvaner. Some of the Sylvaners, especially when they're overcropped, to me don't have very much varietal character. And then we have a variety called Uni Blanc. It's nothing else than our old Italian friend Trebbiano, which is a worthless grape, in Italy and in California. Rather neutral kind of wine. It won't hurt you, but you never would know that you drunk it in some cases. It's so neutral. And Veltliner, an Austrian grape, which in Austria is one of the most important varieties, has never found a real place on the American market. At one time, down in the Hollister area, there were 100 acres or more of Veltliner, and it appeared on a national-wide distribution promotion. And this is about 1944, 43, 42, just early part of the war. But after the war, it disappeared, and I don't know of a single Veltliner on the market at the present time. All right, so much then for the 8 to 14% alcohol wines. Now we come to the 14 to 17% alcohol wines, and these are in a sort of a no man's land because they have to pay the same tax as the 17 to 21% alcohol wines pay, namely 67 cents a gallon federal tax. So there's not much incentive to get into this. Also, they're not terribly stable unless you germ-proof filter them or pasteurize them or add a lot of antiseptic agents. But once in a while you'll find wine in this category. Usually the special types of wines produced for purposes of the church, so-called sacramental or ecclesiastical types of wines. These kinds of wines usually will be stabilized in the 15 to 17% alcohol range. And then there's one very specialized category, and that is where you get Spanish finos and Montanilla wines in Spain and occasionally in this country. I looked at a wine list just the other day and saw a Spanish Montanilla at 15% alcohol being offered for sale here. Since these are dry wines, they're essentially stable, and they're used as aperitif type of wine. You won't find very many of them. Most Spanish wines, whether the Fino type or the Oloroso type, will be at 18% alcohol on the American market. But once in a while in Spain, and very rarely on the American market, you'll find one in this 14 to 17 group. Other than that, you probably never will see a wine on the American market unless you decide to become a priest that's in this range of 14 to 17% of alcohol. Now, the rest of these are all fortified wines, wines to which alcohol has been added, containing somewhere between 17 and 21%. The dichotomy gets rather difficult here, and I probably will not finish this since we're running out of time, but you can take a look at the rest of this. The containing anthocyanin pigments, that's quite clear, and the dichotomy is complete there. It either is red or it's not red. If it's red, it can have a muscat aroma or it does not have a muscat aroma. There are not very many red muscat wines going around the world. There used to be a few pink Aleaticos that were fortified, not made just sweet like they were before. And the novitiate of Las Gatas still puts out a red or black muscatel made from Muscat Hamburg grapes. Rather a nice wine if you like muscats. It's sort of a red muscat port type. Without a muscat aroma and being red, we have the baked odor in California Tokay. It's not very red. You remember that Dr. Singleton told you that California Tokay, notice the small t, was made by blending sherry, port, and Angelica in about equal proportions. It's very popular. It used to be popular over on 2nd and J Street in Sacramento. It's quite popular down in Stockton in the same area. Not as important as it was some few years before. And without a baked odor, and here we have our two types of ports again, the brownish red color, the tawny port, and the red or ruby port or vintage port. So that's pretty dichotomous. At this stage, it gets to get a little bit more sticky. Not containing anthocyanin pigments, well, the dichotomy is still here. It's either muscat or not muscat, and no red color. A lot of muscat wines produced in the world. Muscat Franignan in France, Muscatel in California, Muscat Canelli in Italy, Samos on the island of that name in Greece, Setúbal from a little town south of Lisbon in Portugal, Sitges from a little town south of Barcelona in Spain. There are occasional muscats produced in the Soviet Union that are quite good. You get good muscats from Israel. There are probably 100 different names that I could give you. There are a lot of muscats from Australia and South Africa, for example. Without a muscat aroma, and here, as I said, the dichotomy gets much more difficult. With a special odor due to treatment or aging, and without a special odor due to treatment or aging. Well, the last part is pretty good. The part on page 4, without a special odor due to treatment or aging, that's California Angelica and California White Port, one of them being a little darker than the other. The others are, without making this chart go clear out to the right-hand side of another page or two, I sort of consolidated them down. With a cooked rancio, that's an aged character, raisin or reduced must odor. And there they are, raisin for Malaga, baked for California sherry or Madeira, reduced must or burnt odor, that means boiled down must, Marsala, a rancio, a very old type of smell in Banyuls and Tarragona, you'll never see those. And then the ones instead of having a cooked or Ronceau have an aldehyde odor, would be the sherries of the floor sherries of Spain and France and California. Don't forget to do your library problems and do your makeups.